Hello, and welcome to A Dash of Salt. I'm Dr. Shelley Ann, and I'm so glad you're here. Whether you stumbled upon this podcast by accident or you're here because the subject drew you in, welcome. SALT is an acronym for Society and Learning Today. This podcast was created as an outlet for inviting fresh discussions on sociology and learning theories that impact your world. Each episode includes a wide range of themes that focus on society and everyday learning, whether formal or informal. So let's get stuck in, shall we? Welcome to A Dash of Salt. Today I'm joined by Kate Chandler. Kate is a heritage professional from the UK living in Dublin. She's worked and volunteered for the National Trust in English Heritage and has held roles in volunteer coordination and management. She completed a master's in World Heritage Management and Conservation at University College Dublin, where the focus of her dissertation was on volunteering at national heritage sites. Kate has facilitated voluntary workshops for students in how to get into heritage and has held a voluntary position on the Properties Committee of Antashka. She has a keen interest in the ethics of volunteering, and particularly in heritage volunteering, social equality, and volunteering and well-being. She currently works in the cultural and heritage sector in Dublin. I'm delighted to have you on the podcast today and to speak to you about your volunteer identity and experiences as an active volunteer and the ethics of volunteering, particularly your work in heritage volunteering, social equality, and volunteering and well-being. Welcome, Kate.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So, Kate, I know that you are actively involved with volunteering and have been for many years, and I'd like to start off by talking to you about your own past volunteer experiences. My PhD looked at volunteer influence, exposure, and experience of active adult volunteers to find out how and why they became involved in volunteering and what it means to them, and whether their education, whether formal or informal, influenced their volunteer experiences. And to also provide further insight and understanding of the relationship between somebody's identity and learning through volunteering. So I'm really interested in the relationship between your past and current volunteer experiences. What's your earliest memory of volunteering, or maybe an awareness of what volunteering was, or what it meant to be a volunteer for you?
That's a really good question. I think when I was growing up as a family, we used to visit a lot of old historic properties in rural Somerset in the southwest of England, where we lived. A lot of those were owned and run by the National Trust, which is a heritage organisation, a charity in the United Kingdom that looks after historic properties and land. And in these sites, and they ranged from like big grand houses to gardens and wider landscapes, there were always teams of people there helping out and doing jobs, and in the rooms answering questions about the story of the buildings and gardening. And I think, even though I can't pinpoint the exact moment that I thought, oh, that person's a volunteer, I was always aware that they were there. And I remember distinctly their green and white badges. And I always thought how special it would be to spend time in those places, because as a child they really captured my imagination.
So, Kate, who or what do you believe was your inspiration for volunteering?
I think it was definitely more of a what rather than a who. I, as I said, really loved being in those places, and my imagination just went wild in old places and forests and historic sites. And it was really wanting to spend more time in those places that inspired me to start volunteering. And I've never really been able to summarize it better than I love special places. And I love places that are really steeped in history and stories, and the thought of being able to spend time in those places, and not only that, but go behind the scenes, go into the attics and the servants' quarters, and in the little corners of these places that people don't usually get to go, really inspired me to want to start volunteering.
That's really fascinating. A fascinating reason that, to volunteer. I remember as a young child, a young girl too, going to where I lived in Penn Yan in New York. My maiden name was Oliver, and there was a Carrie Oliver who had a Victorian house in the village center of Penn Yan, and it was a little museum, and we used to go there for school trips, day trips, walk down there, and I was absolutely obsessed with going in there. And I also would often go through the museum tours and think to myself, I wonder where are these stories coming from, and what's in the attic, and the journals that maybe they would. So I completely understand where you're coming from
Yeah.
with that. And I used to be enthralled by the people who would do the speaking, because I thought to myself, oh, they just are so knowledgeable and they just make it sound so interesting.
You think they live there as a child. You think, oh, they live here,
Yeah, they know
and
so
what it's like,
much.
yeah, there's a kind of
Exactly.
magic around.
So did you volunteer during your compulsory school years, or during your higher education
It.
years as well?
Yeah, that was really the busiest time for my volunteering, I suppose. When I was about 14 years old, I joined a local National Trust youth group. And we were ferried in a minivan around to loads of different sites in Somerset, where I lived. And we learnt skills like dry stone walling and scrub bashing and coppicing. Countryside management skills, really. When I was 15, as part of my school's compulsory work experience, I volunteered with the gardener and estate ranger team in a local National Trust property. And after that, I tried a bit of volunteering in the house there, did a bit of room guiding. I was the youngest room guide there by about 50 years, I think, at that point. Helped out at events, did a bit of research. And then I got an internship later at that property. After I did my degree, did a little bit of volunteering at Stonehenge as well, which was just up the road. So I did a lot during that time, and then later on, I came back to my university, Lancaster University, where I did my undergrad degree, and did workshops for students in different disciplines about how to get into heritage, which was another totally different type of volunteering, but volunteering nonetheless. So that was a really interesting transition, I suppose, from having done all of those different roles to coming back and helping other young people figure out how they might get into the heritage sector.
So Kate, do you think that your formal education impacted your desire to volunteer? I know you talked about your experiences and what inspired you, but do you think that your formal learning impacted your volunteering? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think it was the other way around, really. I volunteered in so many different roles because I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted to work in the heritage sector, but I didn't quite know exactly how. So volunteering for me was a way of trying different things out and seeing where my interests might lie. And I was really privileged to be able to do that. I think that's important to remember, that I had the privilege of being able to get to these places to start with. I was either driven when I was younger by my parents, or I had my own car, and I had the time and the ability to do that. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I was very lucky to be able to have that opportunity to sort of dip in and out of different things. And as a result of doing the outdoors volunteering, I very nearly studied countryside management at university. So it really it almost directly impacted on what I decided to do with my further education. And in the end, I decided to study English Lit. I remember this quite viscerally, this moment when I was volunteering with the estate management team at this National Trust property, and we were painting a gate in driving rain, and it was a cold winter's day. And I thought, I don't want to do this. So I thought, okay, fine, maybe countryside management isn't the best way to go. And in the end, I decided to study English literature, because for me, it's always been about stories. That's partly what what enchanted me about those places in the first place was the stories. And eventually, after that, I studied World Heritage Management and Conservation at University College Dublin, which is what brought me to Ireland in the first place.
It's funny that you say that, that you in the driving rain and you thought to yourself, I don't want to do this. I think that every volunteer can identify with at some point when you're volunteering, there always tends to be a low point when you think to yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I I'm doing this for free? I'm giving my time for free. But then I think, as we sort of dig a little bit deeper into it, we just find out how rich the benefits are. And those moments are then something that you can, kind of laugh about later and say, of course it was, only just a little blip in my thought process.
Yeah. Yeah, it becomes part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of that story, as you said. So what kind of volunteering do you do now then, Kate?
I do bits here and there. I suppose I've got a different relationship to volunteering these days than what I had a few years ago. Because I don't do it anymore to figure out what I want to do. I know where I am and what I want now. So it's a bit more of a hobby, a bit more recreational. So I was on the properties committee for An Taisce for a while, which is they're known as the National Trust for Ireland. They own and manage different historic sites and landscapes across Ireland. So I was doing that for some time. And recently I was a volunteer supervisor at the Shaking Bog Festival of Nature, Writing and Art in the Wicklow Mountains, which was fantastic. So I suppose I dip in and out depending on where my interests are. So it's a bit different, I suppose, than how I used to volunteer.
And what's your fondest memory or your experience of volunteering, and why would you consider it to be your fondest memory?
It's so hard, but I think it goes back to the places and being in those places. I remember one of the first times I was volunteering as a room guide in this historic house, and it was a really quiet day, and there was barely anybody in the house, and I had this room to myself, and I was sitting in the window seat looking out at the garden, pretending I lived there. I was about 15 at the time, and there were times when you'd go behind the scenes and you'd go into the rooms that nobody usually got to see, and you were up in the attics and you were in the basements and all these kind of secret places that sort of changed the way you understood a place, because I grew up going to those places, and through my volunteering I understood them, and I got to know them in very different ways, which was really special. And there were times like when I was volunteering at Stonehenge, we used to do this thing every morning that we called waking up the stones, where we a few of us went up to the stone circle behind the ropes, went into the circle itself, and crikey, I mean, I can't describe how huge they are when you're right up beside them. You really get a sense of the scale of these things. And we did that every morning just to check that nothing was there, that nobody was there, because occasionally you did get people sort of trying to camp out there overnight and leaving behind offerings and stuff, and just being there in the morning when no one else was around with the stones was incredible. So I think those moments where I felt a real connection with place are my fondest memories of volunteering.
I think that's really powerful, that idea of, connecting yourself with place and space, and something that you do again freely and for your own, for the benefit of others, but also for, your own gratification as well. There's something really powerful about that.
I think that's really true what you say about the fact that there's no strings attached to that kind of relationship. You're not doing it for money. You're not doing it in order to survive or subsist. You're doing it because you love it, and I think that can lend a kind of freedom to those moments that possibly you don't get as much in other circumstances.
Absolutely. So I'm sure I know the answer to this question, but do you think that you've learned from your volunteer experiences? And if so, what have you learned?
Yeah, I've learned an awful lot. From a very practical point of view, I've learned a lot of skills like dry stone walling and coppicing. And even now, even though that was years ago, when I'm wandering around the countryside at home, if I see dry stone wall as, bit of it has come away, then I'd be packing it back in. So that hasn't left. I mean, I love that, like traditional countryside skills. I've also learned a lot about people, how to talk to people, how to interact with people. And that's something that never really came easily to me. So it was a way of facing the fear, I suppose, and learning to chat to people was one of the most valuable things I've ever learned. And that was thanks to volunteering, I suppose. And I wouldn't say I've learned this in particular, but I think one of the things that volunteering has really impressed upon me is how everybody is equally important, and volunteers can frequently be seen as almost like on the bottom rung of a ladder organizationally, but they are incredible. I mean, volunteers are incredible, and they've got such a wealth of experience and passion and knowledge. And I've met so many amazing people through volunteering who are also volunteers, who are coming at it for all kinds of different reasons with all sorts of different backgrounds. And I think often their value can be overlooked. So that's something that I'm always very keen to stress.
So, Kate, why is volunteering important to you?
I think for me personally, it's volunteering is the reason I'm where I am in my life today. It's the reason I made the career decisions I did, I suppose. It's given me an awful lot in terms of experiences and skills. It's allowed me to foster a deeper relationship with places that I have always loved. And I think in general, if done right, volunteering can be a real force for social good by allowing communities to come in and contribute to a shared goal with no strings attached. It doesn't always work out that way, but I think ideally that is the importance of volunteering. It's that there's a real kind of democracy about it in a way.
So I hit you with all the philosophical and the deep thinking and the past experiences and that kind of thing, answering those questions. And now I'd actually like to talk to you a little bit about, your beliefs in the ethics of volunteering and social equity and well-being, the benefits of volunteering. So tell us what inspired you to get involved with World Heritage and conservation and what you're currently working on now.
Well, I was really aware, I suppose, when I was finishing up my undergrad degree, that there was a big world out there, and I'd seen a bit of how the UK went about managing heritage through organisations like the National Trust and English Heritage, who managed Stonehenge. But I wanted to see how other places did it and understand a little bit more about what heritage might mean on a global scale because of that. So that's what brought me to Dublin, really, because there was a World Heritage Management and Conservation Masters on offer at UCD. So I came over and did that for a year. And now I am working for Dublin City Council Culture Company, who run cultural projects and heritage sites around the city, including the Museum 14 Henrietta Street and Richmond Barracks. And I've been doing all kinds of projects for them, really. I've been there nearly 3 years now. I've been doing oral history projects, talking to people who used to live in Dublin's tenements. I've been managing the schools programme. And at the moment, I'm working with Dublin City Libraries to organise the Dublin Festival of History. So I've involved in lots of different things as part of this work, and I love it. I mean, that it kind of links back to the way the way I treated volunteering in a way, dipping in and out of different things. I like that in a job to get involved in different facets of heritage is something I really enjoy.
Mm-hmm. And it's nice that sort of your volunteering, has rolled into work where now you are being paid, to do the work you do, but it probably still doesn't really feel like work. Does it still feel like your volunteer experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I often think, is there anything else I would rather be doing, or any other area of work I would rather be in? And there isn't. I knew, I was very lucky. I knew from very early on that that's what I wanted to do, and volunteering was my way in to that.
Yeah. So from your perspective and experience, what role does volunteering play in community, and what impact does it have on social equity within societies?
I think volunteering has the power to really bring people together, particularly in local communities. If there is a shared goal or a shared asset, like a heritage site, for example, people come together and work together in order to protect that place or tell its story. That's not to say that everyone does that for purely altruistic reasons. They don't, as you know. People have many different reasons for wanting to volunteer. But I think there's something about doing something as a group, not necessarily just doing something as a group, but doing something together, feeling part of a wider thing. So I met a lot of different volunteers through volunteering myself, and then later through my volunteer management work. And you got people coming into volunteering for so many different reasons. You'd have a lot of people who were very local to the heritage site, and they wanted to do something that was just up the road because they wanted to socialize more. Maybe they were a bit older and they were lonely. So there was a big thing there about the friendships that would be built as part of volunteering, and as a way of tackling loneliness. And I think what's really interesting, and I was it kind of ties into this, because I was listening lately to another podcast, the 10% Happier podcast by Dan Harris. I don't know if you're familiar with it. They had a guest, Johan Hari, who's the author of Lost Connections, about the causes of depression and unhappiness in general. And he was talking about a study done by Dr. Brett Ford in the US, where he and a team were asking the question, what would happen if you were to consciously try and make yourself happier? And they asked this question of thousands of people in the US and in Taiwan and Russia and Japan, asked them all the same question, and invited them to try and make themselves happier. So thousands of people in these 4 different countries all trying to make themselves happier. And then afterwards, they came back to them and they asked them if they felt happier. And in Taiwan and Russia and Japan, they said yes, on the whole. In the US, they didn't. And they were wondering why that was. And what they found really surprised them. And what happened was that generally in the US, when people were trying to make themselves happier, consciously thinking about what happiness was and trying to make themselves happier, they were doing something for themselves. They would go shopping, or they would achieve a goal. In Taiwan and Russia and Japan, generally what they were doing, the people in the study, was they were doing something for somebody else, for a group or for their community. And that was so interesting, how that study at least showed that, at least to some degree, happiness is tied into working towards and achieving something outside of yourself, and something more than just yourself, and something that is for other people, for a greater goal, a shared goal. And for me, that really resonates with how volunteering can help, maybe not solve all the problems that we have as a society, but certainly in the West, I think, with our a super connection, super focus on self, and almost kind of pathological focus on self. Volunteering and having that way of contributing to something beyond yourself is really important.
Absolutely. I really love how you brought in, that element into when we were talking about community and its impact on society, and you just rolled so naturally into the contribution of volunteering to well-being, because and I'm not surprised, to be honest with you, about sort of the results of that American perspective. There while there are loads of people in America who volunteer and who live by the ethos of giving unto others and that type of thing, and would have been raised with that same mentality. They're generally, Americans in general are so much more selfish and self-centered, and I can see why that could contribute to to feelings of unhappiness, where those who contribute through volunteering would say, no, I'm in a really good place, and it makes me quite happy. So that didn't surprise me, but at the same time, it's really good to make note of that, and to have heard that especially from an international perspective. So thank you for sharing that as well. Is the cultural and the heritage sector impacted by volunteers and by volunteering? Do you rely heavily on the work of volunteers to sustain and maintain the infrastructure of this sector?
Yes, and particularly in the UK, which in a way is or can be wonderful, because you've got a lot of engagement is a word that's really overused, I think, but you do have a lot of, I suppose, involvement in looking after special places from the local community who have, because I always think feel isn't quite strong enough a word, but they have an ownership over their local heritage and their local sites, and because of that, you get a real sense of passion when you go to those places and you're greeted by volunteers who they don't have to be there, they're choosing to be there. So that from that point of view, it's wonderful. I think that there is a danger of relying too heavily on volunteers for reasons that I might expand upon in a moment. And I think that that's particularly, excuse me, a problem in the heritage sector in the UK. I mean, that's possibly in other countries, I don't know. I'm speaking mainly from my experience in the UK, but there are certainly a lot of organisations in the heritage sector in the UK who state quite openly and proudly that they have a large team of volunteers and wouldn't be able to open their doors without volunteers.
You've spent a good many years working as a volunteer coordinator and a manager. And talk to us a little bit more about the ethics of volunteering, and what you think are important aspects of ethical volunteering.
Sure, and I suppose again, my experience in volunteer management is firmly in a heritage perspective, in a UK heritage perspective. So I guess I'm speaking from that experience alone, really. But it's a complicated subject. The way I see it, there are two major ethical issues, or two kind of thorny areas when it comes to ethics and volunteering. And the first one of those is that volunteering is, or often is, a luxury of the privileged. And the second one is that volunteers are vulnerable to exploitation, or they can be vulnerable to exploitation. So first of all, going back to volunteering as a luxury, I went to an interview once for a job after I'd done my internship. And when I spoke about my internship, which was unpaid, the person interviewing me told me that I was very lucky that I was able to do that for free. And I remember feeling at the time kind of indignant about that, because at the time I was doing a full-time internship, unpaid. I was working evenings in a pub, and I was working weekends at Stonehenge as a historic property steward, which were both, the latter two were both paid roles. So I was doing everything I could to support myself in that unpaid role, and I was exhausted. And I suppose when I heard the challenge to that, I, as I say, I was a little bit taken aback, but I thought about it, and it was one of those typical light bulb moments, really, because I was still able to I managed to do that because I was able-bodied, I didn't have dependents, and I had my own car, and those that is privilege. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had any of those things to contend with.
Mm-hmm.
So they were absolutely right, and I'm incredibly privileged to have been able to do any of the volunteering that I have done. You know, and I think, I suppose, the internship situation is an interesting one. That kind of brings me on to the second point, which is that volunteers are vulnerable to exploitation. There's a great organization called Fair Museum Jobs, and they are a grassroots organization seeking to improve recruitment and management practices in museums specifically, but there's a lot of application to the wider heritage and cultural sector. And they've developed a manifesto for volunteer and staff recruitment and job advertising. And in that manifesto, their approach to volunteering is no one should have to work for free. Nobody should have to work for free. And heritage as a sector is really bad for this. There is a lot of competition for jobs. And because of that, you have to prove yourself in lots of different ways. And there is an expectation almost that you will have put in the hours as a volunteer, given your time for free in order to get paid work, which is often, you know, it's not a wealthy sector. It's often just above minimum wage anyway. Mm-hmm. And internships, I suppose, are a good example of that. Fair Museum Jobs recommend that, first of all, internships should be paid. Second of all, they should have clear learning outcomes. But overall, their suggestion is that voluntary positions shouldn't replace paid work. They shouldn't have duties or responsibilities that one would normally expect from a paid role. That's in their manifesto. And I think where volunteers find themselves doing the work that might normally be under the remit of paid staff, or might be of such a responsibility that you'd be expected to be paid for it, that's where it gets problematic. And this happens widely. And I've known senior management in some places to almost boast about volunteers as a cost-cutting technique, because the heritage is not a particularly well-off sector. It's, you know, money is always short. It's in a way quite predictable, particularly when you have such a willing supply of people who want to come and help. But you end up, if you go down that route too far, you end up relying on volunteers to open your doors, and you end up having to ask volunteers again and again to come in to cover work that needs to be done, covering essential areas, you know, and that then you're kind of pushing it a little bit, and there's a question about, you know, you're questioning, well, is it really volunteering if they're feeling like they have to come in order for the place to open? It creates an enormous stress on staff as well, because you don't want to do that, you know. So I think when you combine those two, when you combine volunteering as a luxury that is available to some, with a recruitment process that gives priority to people who have voluntary experience, you're essentially putting a price tag on working in that sector. You're blocking people who can't afford to work for free. And there are a lot of issues with the heritage sector in the UK. You know, it's by many, it's not considered particularly safe or welcoming for people of color or for LGBTQI people. So you end up having, with all of those factors combined, a kind of almost like a stagnating workforce of white, middle-class, cisgendered, heteronormative people who are responsible for curating and telling the story of a much, much wider and more varied group of people. And there are so many well-meaning and well-intentioned people in those organizations. It's a structural thing. And there have been a lot of inroads made in terms of challenging that particular, I suppose, tunnel-visioned view of what heritage is. But until there's work done at all levels of an organization, including and beginning with its workforce, its staff and its volunteers, you're not going to get true and meaningful change. So I think if you're thinking about the important aspects of ethical volunteering, if you're in a position of power, if you have influence over the recruitment or management of a team of volunteers, you need to first of all reflect on your reasons for having volunteers. And if it's to save money, then that should be an immediate red flag. And you want to make sure that your roles aren't directly replacing paid jobs, and that what the volunteering you're doing is based on meeting people halfway. I think when you start to lose sight of the individual, that's when you can get into trouble. And you want to know what each individual volunteer wants as a person. What are they bringing? What do they want to get out of volunteering? Why do they want to volunteer? Not as a test, but as a way of understanding what matters to them. And checking in with them regularly to make sure that those expectations are being met. And I think the Fair Museum Jobs Manifesto is a really great starting point as a guideline for trying to improve ethics in volunteer recruitment and management.
Yeah, and I would say that you really brought up a difficult conversation. That volunteer coordinators and managers, in various volunteer organizations, need to be having is, addressing that lack of diversity first and foremost. That don't, that where it doesn't, the volunteers don't always, represent the wider community, and to heritage and conservation sites. There needs to be a look at how do you diversify. A real person's experiences and their thoughts on something like that is something that volunteer managers and that type of thing need to hear. So, and sometimes experts overlook those important pieces, where other people can step back, step away from the situation and say, are you recognizing this? Are you seeing this? Because this is a bit of an issue. I'm really glad that you brought that up and brought it out into the open, and you did so, gracefully and, gently, in a really, respectful and responsive way. So, thank you for sharing that. If someone wanted to get involved in volunteering for their community, especially in heritage conservation, something that you have the most experience with, what would you suggest that they do?
Well, I suppose there's a few different things you could do. Firstly, think about where you might want to get involved. Is there a particular place or a particular museum or a particular area that you're interested in? If not, that's okay, but that might be a good starting point. A lot of places have websites these days. Larger organizations might have a wider landing page when it comes to volunteering opportunities, but other smaller ones will, might have a list of opportunities that are coming up. But to be honest, I think the best thing you could do is just go and talk to people face to face or over the phone. Emails can often get lost, and heritage is a notorious sector for emails kind of get it going to the bottom of the pile sometimes, not put through any ill will, but because a lot of the time the people looking at them might be dragged in different directions. So I would always suggest either picking up the phone and giving a call, or going somewhere and talking to somebody face to face, and just have a chat with them and see where what you want might meet what they want, and see how you can meet in the middle.
That's a really great idea, actually. Just go and ask, how can I get involved? And actually, that human engagement, being able to, speak uh, with another person, and talk about your passions, and how can you represent and bring your passion to the table, and contribute to um, you know to empowering that organization that you're thinking about volunteering with. Is it says a lot more when you say it in person than through email. So before we say goodbye, do you have any final words of wisdom, or advice for our listeners?
Oh gosh, I think if you are in a position of power when it comes to volunteers, make sure that you're reflecting on that, and make sure that you are using that to improve the ethics of volunteering in your area, because we have, there is a way to go still, and there's always room for reflection and checking in all the time, talking to people. I think at the essence of it comes down to that. Make sure that you're talking to people, and you're treating everybody as a fellow human. Everyone has different reasons for volunteering, so make sure you're checking in with them. And if you are a volunteer or would like to be a volunteer, then, as I say, just don't be afraid to go and have a chat, even if you think that there might be no way that there'd be an opportunity for you in the area you're interested in. Just take a chance, and you never know what might come out of it.
Thank you for being a guest today. It was a really fabulous conversation from my perspective.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely talking to you.
I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion on A Dash of Salt, a space where you'll always find fresh and current discussions on society and learning today, seasoned with just the right touch of experts in education and a dash of sociological imagination. Please be sure to like and share this episode, and don't forget to subscribe to A Dash of Salt on Podbean so that you don't miss the next episode. Thanks so much, and we'll chat again soon.